She is the only woman in history to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. But there is one question no award has ever answered. What does it actually cost to build a legend? For over 50 years, the world saw the black chiffon, the voice that could crack open the chest of a stranger, the woman who seemed to exist in a frequency slightly different from everyone around her. What the world did not see was the tiny apartment in Los Angeles, the knees on someone else's floor, the years spent inside a chemical fog that quietly erased the songwriter from within, while she kept showing up, kept smiling, kept spinning. Behind one of the best-selling albums in history, 5 people were simultaneously falling apart. Behind the sobriety she bled to earn, a new trap was waiting, this one prescribed by a doctor. And behind the woman, the world turned into myth. There was a girl who learned to sing before she could read, and who spent decades trying to survive the weight of her own voice. What really happens when you build an empire and feel invisible inside it? Who was Stevie Nicks before the world decided who she was? And how does someone lose everything? The love, the friends, entire years of their own mind, and still choose, again and again, to walk back out onto that stage? To answer that, we have to go back to the beginning, before the fame, and before Fleetwood Mac, before the legend, to a family that never stopped moving, and a 4-year-old child who already carried something the world would take decades to recognize. Stephanie Lynn Nicks was born on May 26, 1948, in Phoenix, Arizona, into a family that moved so often the word home felt more like a rumor than a place. Her father, Jess Nicks, was a driven corporate executive whose ambitions pulled the family across state lines with the regularity of seasons. Phoenix to Albuquerque, Albuquerque to El Paso, El Paso to San Francisco, San Francisco to Los Angeles. By the time Stevie reached high school, she had attended more schools than most children attend in an entire childhood. Roots were a luxury she was never allowed to keep. And yet, inside that restlessness, one thing never moved: her voice. It was her grandfather, Aaron Jess Nicks, a struggling country singer who spent his life chasing a dream the industry never handed him, who first heard something extraordinary in his granddaughter. She was barely 4 years old when he placed a small harmonica in her hands and sat beside her, and teaching her to feel music before she could understand it. They sang together on long car rides, at kitchen tables, in the quiet hours when the rest of the world had gone to sleep. He gave her not just songs, but a sense of identity. The understanding, planted deep and early, that her voice was not simply a sound. It was who she was. When her parents gently suggested that perhaps Aaron was encouraging the child too much, that perhaps a more practical path deserved attention, Stevie's grandfather refused to surrender. "She has something," he insisted. "Don't take it from her." It was the first time someone fought for her gift, before she was old enough to fight for it herself. It would not be the last time she needed someone to believe in her before she believed in herself. By the time the family settled in Arcadia, California, during her high school years, Stevie had already made a private, unshakable decision. She would sing, not as a hobby, not as a pleasant distraction, as a life, as the only life worth living. While her classmates mapped out colleges and careers, she was writing songs in notebooks, studying Janis Joplin and Joan Baez with the devotion of someone learning a sacred language, absorbing every note as if her future depended on it. Because in her mind, it did. It was at Arcadia High School that she met the person who would become, for the next decade, the great love of her life, and the great complication of it. Lindsey Buckingham was lean, intense, musically gifted in a way that felt almost unsettling and entirely certain of his own brilliance. They were drawn to each other with the helpless momentum of two people who recognize something essential in a stranger: the particular loneliness of someone who hears the world differently than everyone around them. They began playing music together before they truly knew each other, and in doing so, I discovered that their voices fit in a way that felt less like rehearsal and more like fate. His guitar beneath her voice created something neither could produce alone. It was musical and romantic, and, from the very beginning, dangerously entangled in ways neither of them fully understood. They moved to San Francisco together in the late 1960s, chasing the electric promise of a city that had briefly become the center of the musical universe. But the universe, as it turned out, was not waiting for them. The clubs were crowded with other dreamers. The record labels were indifferent. The beautiful chaos of the summer of love had already curdled into something harder and more commercial. And two earnest young musicians from the suburbs of Los Angeles were not what anyone was looking for. They pressed on. They formed a duo, Buckingham Nicks, playing wherever anyone would have them. Small venues, college bars, the parties where the host cared more about the drinks than the music. They recorded a self-titled album in 1973, a collection of songs that, listened to today, reveals exactly how much talent was already present and exactly how little the industry was prepared to reward it. The album was dropped by Polydor Records before it found an audience. The label did not even attempt a promotional campaign. It simply vanished, taking with it whatever momentum they had managed to build. The years that followed were not romantic. They were grinding, humiliating, and exhausting in the way that only sustained failure can be. Stevie waitressed at a restaurant called Clementine's in Los Angeles, rising before dawn to serve coffee to strangers who never looked at her face. She cleaned houses. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees in homes that belonged to people who had achieved exactly the kind of life she was beginning to fear she would never reach. She was 25 years old, working as a cleaning woman, writing songs in whatever fragments of time remained after the shifts ended. There were nights she sat alone in the small apartment she shared with Lindsey and allowed herself to feel the full weight of it. The gap between who she believed she was and what the world was reflecting back. Those nights were not gentle. They were the kind that carve a person from the inside, that either break something permanently or harden it into something unbreakable. Lindsey, under the pressure of failure and financial strain, grew more volatile. The relationship that had begun in music became saturated with tension, his frustration turning inward and outward in equal measure, her patience thinning under the weight of dreams deferred. They fought. They reconciled. They made music that was somehow better for the friction, which made everything more confusing. Love and creativity had become impossible to separate from pain, and neither of them knew yet how much that pattern would cost them. Then, in late 1974, a phone call arrived that would change everything. Mick Fleetwood, the drummer of a British rock band called Fleetwood Mac, had heard the Buckingham Nicks album at a recording studio and been stopped cold by what he heard. He needed a guitarist. He called Lindsey. Lindsey, unwilling to leave without Stevie, made a quiet demand that would alter the trajectory of both their lives. Take us both, or neither. Mick said yes. Stevie Nicks was 26 years old, scrubbing floors in Los Angeles, when the door she had been throwing herself against for a decade finally opened. Not gently, not ceremoniously, but completely. She walked through it. The band Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham joined in late 1974 was not the band the world would come to know. Fleetwood Mac was already a decade old, already wounded, already carrying the particular exhaustion of a group that had survived so many incarnations it had almost forgotten its own original shape. Founded in London in 1967 by guitarist Peter Green, the band had lost its founder to a devastating mental breakdown. He cycled through members with alarming frequency and arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1970s, trailing a reputation for brilliant instability. Mick Fleetwood and bassist John McVie were the spine of the band. The rhythm section that had outlasted everything, including the departure of the woman who had briefly steadied them, keyboardist and vocalist Christine Perfect, who had married John McVie and joined the band as Christine McVie. By the time Stevie and Lindsay arrived, the band was a collection of bruised survivors held together by habit and the stubborn refusal to stop. What happened next was not gradual. It was volcanic. The addition of Stevie's voice and Lindsay's guitar transformed the band's sound with an immediacy that shocked even the people inside it. Their self-titled album, released in 1975, climbed to #1 on the Billboard charts and stayed in the top 10 for an entire year. Songs like Rhiannon are written by Stevie in 10 minutes, she later said, as if it had arrived from somewhere outside her, introduced the world to a new kind of rock femininity. Not aggressive, not submissive, something older and stranger and more powerful than either. Stevie Nicks became, almost overnight, one of the most recognizable figures in popular music. The spinning, the chiffon, the voice that moved between a whisper and a wail with unsettling ease. Audiences did not simply enjoy her, and they were transfixed by her. Women saw in her something they had not seen before on a rock stage. A woman who occupied her power without apology, who seemed to exist in a frequency slightly different from everyone around her. But the stage, as it always does, concealed the wreckage backstage. By 1976, the private lives of every member of Fleetwood Mac were simultaneously disintegrating. John and Christine McVie, after 8 years of marriage, were divorcing. Mick Fleetwood had discovered his wife was having an affair with his best friend. And Stevie and Lindsay, the couple whose voices had helped build the band's new identity, were falling apart with the slow, grinding brutality of two people who love each other and have finally run out of ways to make that love survivable. The relationship had never been simple. Lindsay's intensity, which made him an extraordinary musician, also made him a difficult partner. Controlling in the studio, yet volatile in private, capable of a cutting cruelty that left marks long after the words had faded. Stevie, who had spent years subordinating her needs to the dream they shared, had begun to find that the dream had arrived, but the peace she imagined it would bring had not. She ended the romantic relationship, but she did not leave the band. That decision, to remain in close professional proximity to a man she had loved and lost, and to stand beside him on stages in front of millions of people while the wound was still open, was either the bravest or the most painful thing she had ever done. Possibly both. Lindsay never fully recovered from it. Decades later, he would admit, with the raw honesty of a man still carrying the weight, that losing Stevie was the defining rupture of his life. For Stevie, the end of their romance did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of loneliness. So the particular ache of someone who must smile beside the person they are grieving. And yet, from that wreckage, the band made Rumours. Recorded in 1976 and released in February 1977, Rumours is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of popular music. Not because of its technical perfection, though it is technically perfect, but because of what it cost the people who made it. Every song on that album was written inside the eye of a personal storm. Christine McVie wrote about the dissolution of her marriage. Lindsay wrote about losing Stevie. And Stevie wrote The Chain, Gold Dust Woman, and Dreams. The latter becoming, decades later, the most streamed classic rock song in the history of Spotify. Dreams was written in Sly Stone's recording studio, in a side room, in under an hour. Stevie sat alone with a keyboard and a set of headphones, and wrote a song about the end of love with the quiet precision of someone who had been thinking about it for a very long time. Thunder only happens when it's raining, she sang. Players only love you when they're playing. Lines so simple, they sounded like folk wisdom. Lines so true, they felt like confession. The album sold over 40 million copies worldwide. It held the #1 position on the Billboard charts for 31 weeks. It won the Grammy for Album of the Year in 1978. It made every member of Fleetwood Mac extraordinarily wealthy, and, in the particular irony that fame specializes in, did not make a single one of them happy. Because to make Rumours, they had to live inside their pain every single day. Studio sessions lasted 16 hours. Tensions between Stevie and Lindsay erupted regularly. Arguments that spilled from the control room into the corridors, with that silenced engineers and producers who understood they were witnessing something too raw and too private to interrupt. Lindsay's grief had curdled, in places, into something harder. There were moments, people who were present would later recall, when his treatment of Stevie crossed a line that had nothing to do with music. Stevie endured it. She showed up every day. She sang with heartbreaking precision. She contributed some of the album's most beloved songs. And she did it all while carrying a private burden she had not yet told anyone about. A pregnancy that she quietly ended during the Rumours period. A decision made in the brutal calculus of a woman who understood that the life growing inside her had arrived at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible relationship, inside the most chaotic season of her existence. She spoke about it only decades later, and with the careful honesty of someone who had made peace with a choice that had never stopped being painful. She said, with characteristic directness, that if she had kept that child, there would have been no Fleetwood Mac, no Rumours, no solo career, no decades of music. She did not say it without grief. She said it with the complicated clarity of a woman who had learned to hold contradictions without letting them destroy her. Rumours made Fleetwood Mac immortal. But immortality, as Stevie was about to discover, has a price that the album sales figures never reflect. She was 30 years old, standing at the top of the world, and she was about to begin the longest and most dangerous descent of her life. By 1981, Stevie Nicks had everything the music industry could offer, and almost nothing she actually needed. Fleetwood Mac was one of the highest-grossing touring acts in the world. Her face appeared on magazine covers with the regularity of weather. Strangers wept at her concerts, sang her words back to her with the fervor of people reciting something sacred, reached toward the stage as if proximity to her might transfer some of the magic they believed she possessed. And she was profoundly, quietly, devastatingly lonely. The end of her relationship with Lindsay had not healed with time. It had calcified, transformed from an open wound into a permanent ache that she carried onto every stage, into every studio, through every city, on every tour that seemed to blur together into an endless procession of arenas and hotel rooms and the particular silence that follows an ovation when the lights go down and the crowd disappears and you are left alone with yourself again. She had begun using cocaine. It did not begin as addiction. It rarely does. It began as a solution, a practical answer to the physical demands of performing night after night, of maintaining the energy required to be Stevie Nicks in front of 60,000 people when the woman underneath that name was exhausted and grieving and running on fumes. Cocaine, in the circles she moved through, was as unremarkable as aspirin. Everyone used it. No one discussed it. It was simply part of the landscape of rock and roll in the late 1970s, as ambient and accepted as the stage smoke that surrounded her every entrance. But for Stevie, it became something else. Something that filled, temporarily and treacherously, the spaces that loneliness had carved. The confidence it provided was seductive. The sense of invincibility, of sharpness, of being fully present in a life that otherwise felt like it was happening slightly outside her reach. She would later admit, with the unflinching honesty that became one of her defining qualities, deeply susceptible to it. Not because she was weak, because she was in pain, and the pain needed somewhere to go. See, in 1981, alongside the ongoing demands of Fleetwood Mac, she released her debut solo album, Belladonna. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It produced 2 top 10 singles, Edge of 17, and a duet with Tom Petty, Stop Draggin' My Heart Around, that announced to anyone still paying attention that Stevie Nicks did not need a band to fill an arena. She was the arena. The album was a declaration of independence, creative, personal, and symbolic. For years inside Fleetwood Mac, her songs had competed for space with Lindsay's vision, with Christine's contributions, with the democratic tensions of a band where 5 strong personalities fought for the same limited real estate on every record. Belladonna was hers alone. Every choice, every sound, every image belonged to her. It was the first time in her professional life that she had stood entirely in her own light, and the light was extraordinary. But the cost was invisible in the photographs. The years between 1981 and 1986 were, by Stevie's own accounting, the years she most nearly lost herself. The solo success ran parallel to an escalating dependency that was consuming her health, her relationships, and the creative clarity that had always been her most essential instrument. She was using cocaine daily. The quantity had grown from recreational to medicinal to something that no longer had a category, and her weight dropped. Her voice, the voice that had made her famous, began to show the strain. A roughness, a fragility at the edges, that engineers worked quietly to compensate for in the studio. The relationships during this period were intense and brief, and uniformly painful. Don Henley, the Eagles drummer, entered her life in the early 1980s with the force of someone who recognized her loneliness because it mirrored his own. So their relationship was passionate and turbulent and marked by the particular dynamic of 2 extremely famous, extremely damaged people trying to find stability in each other and discovering only that 2 instabilities do not produce balance. It was during this relationship that Stevie became pregnant for the second time. She did not keep the child. She later said that she and Don had discussed it, that the decision was mutual, and that it left her with a grief that settled into the permanent collection of losses she carried beneath the stage persona. Don Henley, in one of rock history's more haunting gestures, wrote the song Leather and Lace with her. A song about the tenderness between 2 people who are too broken to fully reach each other. And years later wrote The Heart of the Matter, widely interpreted as being partly about their ending. Some loves, Stevie understood, are most eloquent in their aftermath. She married, briefly, in 1983. Kim Anderson was the widower of her closest friend, Robin Anderson, who had died of leukemia just months after her wedding. A loss so sudden and so savage that Stevie described it as the moment she first understood that the world was capable of a cruelty entirely indifferent to what you deserved. She married Kim, she later acknowledged, out of grief rather than love, an attempt to remain close to Robin, to keep some piece of her friend alive in the architecture of daily life. The marriage lasted 3 months. It left her more isolated than before, carrying not only her own grief, but the guilt of a decision made in the wrong season for the wrong reasons. The mid-1980s brought more albums, more tours, more success, measured in units and chart positions that told a story entirely different from the one being lived. The Wild Heart in 1983, He'd Rock a Little in 1985. Each record demonstrated the stubborn vitality of her talent, even as the person producing that talent was quietly eroding. By 1986, the people closest to her were frightened. Her physician delivered a verdict with no softening. The septum of her nose, damaged by years of cocaine use, was approaching a threshold beyond which the damage would be irreparable. He told her, with clinical directness, that she was closer to serious permanent harm than she understood. That if she continued, the voice, the instrument that was not simply her career but her identity, the thing her grandfather had first heard in a 4-year-old child and called extraordinary, might not survive. She checked into the Betty Ford Center. The 30 days she spent there were, by her description, among the most disorienting of her life. She arrived as one of the most famous women in rock and was treated, undeliberately and correctly, as simply a person who needed help. No special treatment, no private arrangements. The same structured days, the same group sessions, the same confrontation with the mechanisms of dependency that every other patient faced. She found it humbling in the precise sense of the word. It returned her to the ground, stripped away the mythology, and forced her to sit with the unmedicated truth of who she was and what she had been doing to herself. She left clean. But the story did not end there, because addiction rarely offers clean endings. What replaced the cocaine, prescribed by a doctor who believed he was helping her manage the anxiety that sobriety had suddenly made visible, was a benzodiazepine called Klonopin. She took it faithfully, as instructed, trusting that a prescribed medication carried a different moral weight than what she had surrendered. She was wrong, not about the morality, but about the safety. For the next 8 years, Klonopin would do to her what cocaine had begun. Slowly, quietly, with the particular cruelty of a dependency that wore the disguise of medicine. There is a particular kind of disappearance that happens in plain sight. Not the dramatic vanishing of someone who walks away from everything and is never seen again, but the slow, incremental dimming of a person who is still present, still performing, still photographed and interviewed and celebrated, while something essential inside them quietly goes dark. That is what the Klonopin years did to Stevie Nicks. From 1987 to 1993, she took the medication as prescribed, in the doses her doctor recommended, with the dutiful compliance of someone who had already surrendered one battle with dependency and was determined not to repeat it. She was not abusing it. She was not seeking a high. She was simply following medical instruction while the drug rewired her from the inside, flattening her emotions, dulling her creativity, replacing the sharp and vivid inner life that had always been the source of her writing with something that felt, as she later described it, like being wrapped in wet cotton. Present, but muffled. Alive, but somehow not inhabiting the aliveness. She gained weight. 60 pounds, she would later say without flinching, because she had learned by then that the truth told plainly carries more dignity than the truth softened into something palatable. The body that had become iconic, Turn to the chiffon and the boots and the particular way she moved across a stage, as if the music were a physical wind she was leaning into, changed in ways that the tabloids noted with casual cruelty. She noticed the headlines. She did not have the emotional bandwidth under the medication's fog to feel them fully, which was perhaps the one mercy of those years. Her output slowed. The prolific songwriter who had once written Dreams in Under an Hour sat for days in front of notebooks that remained empty. The melodies that had always arrived unbidden, as if from somewhere outside herself, stopped coming. She described it later with the particular grief of a musician who has lost access to their own instrument. Not the voice this time, but the deeper instrument. The interior frequency that the voice had always been translating. It had gone silent, and she did not know if it was temporary or permanent. Fleetwood Mac reconvened in 1990 for the Behind the Mask album, and Stevie participated, but her contributions were limited, and her presence was diminished. Those who worked with her during this period have spoken carefully but consistently about a woman who seemed to be observing her own life from a slight distance. Professional, present, but somehow not fully there. Lindsey Buckingham had left the band in 1987, a departing in the aftermath of an argument that had been building for years and finally detonated in a rehearsal room with a ferocity that shook everyone present. His absence removed both the greatest creative tension of Stevie's professional life and the person whose difficult presence had paradoxically kept her most alive in the studio. Without that friction, without that particular alchemy of love and resentment and mutual creative provocation, something in the band's chemistry went flat. And the music they made without Lindsey was competent. It was not remarkable. And Stevie, moving through those years in the Klonopin haze, did not have the resources to compensate for what his absence had taken. It was her psychiatrist, eventually, who named what was happening. He sat across from her and told her with careful directness that the drug she had been taking faithfully for years had become its own crisis, that the dependency it had created was, in its neurological effects, more difficult to reverse than the cocaine she had surrendered a decade earlier, that the fog she had been living inside was not a symptom of her personality or her age or the natural diminishment that fame sometimes produces. It was chemical, and it could be addressed. Getting off Klonopin took 45 days in a facility in San Francisco. 45 days that she has described as among the most physically brutal of her life. The withdrawal symptoms arriving in waves, and the anxiety that the medication had been suppressing returning with a violence that felt like punishment. The sleeplessness and the trembling and the gradual agonizing process of her nervous system remembering how to function without chemical assistance. She emerged in 1993 changed in ways that took years to fully understand. The weight began to come off. The notebooks began to fill again. The melodies started returning. Tentatively at first, like animals approaching a clearing after a long winter, testing the stillness before committing to it. She described the first song she wrote after the Klonopin years with the reverence of someone recounting a religious experience. It was proof, she said, that she was still in there, that the years of fog had not erased her, that whatever it was her grandfather had heard in a 4-year-old child singing in the back seat of a car was still present, still intact, still hers. She was 45 years old, and beginning in some essential way for the third time. The 1990s brought a quieter kind of reinvention. She released Street Angel in 1994, an album that bore the marks of the transition she was still navigating. Uneven in places, raw in others, but containing within it the unmistakable evidence of a voice and a sensibility that had survived things that would have silenced most people. Critics were mixed. Stevie was undeterred, and she had learned, in the hardest possible school, that survival itself was a form of creation. And then, in 1997, Fleetwood Mac did something no one expected. The dance reunion brought Lindsay back. It brought the original lineup, the one that had made Rumours, the one that had lived inside each other's heartbreak and produced something eternal from it, back onto a stage together for the first time in a decade. Here's the concert film and live album that resulted became one of the best-selling live releases in history, debuting at #1 and reminding a new generation that what Fleetwood Mac had made in the 1970s was not nostalgia. It was architecture. It had been built to last. Standing beside Lindsay again was not simple. It was never simple. The years had not dissolved the history between them. The love, the loss, the professional wounds that had accumulated across decades of proximity. But they had, perhaps, softened the sharpest edges. There were moments during the dance performances, captured on film and studied by fans ever since, when Stevie and Lindsay looked at each other with an expression that defied easy categorization. Not romantic, not hostile. Something more complicated and more human than either. The look of two people who had shaped each other so profoundly that the shaping was permanent, regardless of everything that had come after. She allowed herself to feel it. She sang Gold Dust Woman and The Chain and Dreams to arenas full of people who had carried those songs through their own decades of loss and love and survival, and she understood, perhaps more clearly than she ever had before, what the music had always been doing. It had never been only hers. The moment she released it into the world, it had become everyone's. Every person in every arena had lived inside those songs, had used them, had needed them. That knowledge, the understanding of what she had given and what it had meant, was not something that fame had taught her. Fame had only taught her about scale. This was something different. This was the comprehension of purpose, of why the voice her grandfather had recognized in a child deserved the life she had fought, and fallen, and risen again to give it. But even in that understanding, even in the warmth of reunion and the reassurance of relevance, the losses were accumulating. And one of them, the most professionally devastating of the decade, was still coming. In 2018, during the preparation for what would become the An Evening with Fleetwood Mac tour, the tension between Stevie and Lindsay reached a breaking point that no reunion could survive. The specific details have been reported with varying degrees of accuracy. But the essential truth is this: Stevie delivered an ultimatum. Either Lindsay leaves or she does. The band chose Stevie. Lindsay Buckingham was removed from Fleetwood Mac after nearly 50 years. He was blindsided. He was, by his own public accounting, devastated. Not simply by the professional rupture, but by the manner of it. The sense that the woman he had loved and lost and remained bound to through decades of complicated creative partnership had, in the end, chosen to end it without a conversation that gave him the chance to respond. He filed a lawsuit against the band. It was settled out of court. Stevie did not speak extensively about it publicly, but those close to her understood that the decision had cost her something significant. That removing Lindsay from the band, even when it had become necessary for her own well-being, was not a triumphant act. It was a grief of its own. The ending of something that had begun in a high school hallway in Arcadia, California, when two young people who heard the world differently recognized each other across a room. And it had taken 5 decades to fully close. And closing it left a silence that no amount of applause could fill. There is a category of loss that exists entirely apart from romantic grief or professional rupture. It is the loss of the people who knew you before the world decided who you were. The ones who called you by your name without the weight of mythology attached to it. who remembered the girl before the icon, who could look at you across a table and see, without effort, the person underneath the performance. For Stevie Nicks, that category of loss began long before the world noticed. But in the years between 2017 and 2022, it arrived with a frequency and a finality that reshaped everything. It began with Tom Petty. Their friendship had started in the early 1980s, forged in the particular crucible of two musicians who recognized in each other an authenticity that the industry was constantly pressuring them to compromise. Tom was from Gainesville, Florida, the son of a family that had offered him little warmth and less encouragement. He had arrived in Los Angeles with the same stubborn refusal to be diminished that Stevie carried from her own complicated origins. They understood each other without needing to explain themselves. That kind of understanding, in a world that constantly reinterprets you for its own purposes, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, among the rarest. Their musical collaboration had produced some of the most beloved moments of both their careers. Stop Draggin' My Heart Around from Belladonna on I Will Run to You. The easy, instinctive harmony of two voices that fit together without effort because the people producing them fit together the same way. They toured together, appeared on each other's records, sat in dressing rooms in cities whose names they had both forgotten before the tour bus reached the next one, and talked about music and life and the strange privilege and burden of having given so much of themselves to something so public. He was, she said more than once, one of the greatest friends she had ever had. Not in the effusive press release sense of the word, in the specific, irreplaceable sense. The friend who tells you the truth, who has seen you at your worst and remained, who makes you laugh in the precise moments when laughter feels impossible. On October 2nd, 2017, Tom Petty died of an accidental drug overdose. He was 66 years old. Stevie was in the middle of a solo tour when the news reached her. She did not cancel the show. She walked onto the stage in Los Angeles that night and dedicated it to him, and sang with the particular intensity of someone who understands, in real time, that the performance is now also a memorial. The audience wept. She did not, or if she did not do it where they could see. She saved it for later, for the private hours, for the space where grief is allowed to be what it actually is, rather than what a stage requires it to be. She said afterward that losing Tom felt like losing a piece of the version of herself that only he had been able to see clearly. Every person who knows us holds a different angle on who we are. When they leave, they take that angle with them. It does not go anywhere else. It simply ceases to exist in the world. She carried that loss forward, as she had learned to carry all of them. Not by setting it aside, but by folding it into the ongoing texture of her life, allowing it to inform the music without letting it silence the music. That was the discipline she had learned across decades of surviving things that should have broken her. Grief was not an obstacle to creativity. It was, if you were willing to go into it rather than around it, one of creativity's most honest sources. But the losses were not finished. Christine McVie had been Stevie's closest companion inside the complicated ecosystem of Fleetwood Mac for nearly 50 years. Their friendship was one of the quieter love stories of rock history. Less documented than the romantic entanglements, less dramatic than the professional conflicts, but perhaps more enduring than either. Christine was the person Stevie could turn to in the middle of a tour, when everything felt impossible, and find not counsel, not industry wisdom, but simple human presence. A cup of tea, a dry observation that made everything momentarily absurd in the best way, and the knowledge that someone nearby understood. Christine had left Fleetwood Mac in 1998, retreating to England with the decisive finality of someone who had genuinely had enough. Of touring, of the American pace, of the particular exhaustion that comes from spending decades inside a band that generated as much drama as music. She and Stevie had maintained their friendship across the distance, but the physical separation had been its own quiet loss. To the daily absence that Stevie had adjusted to without ever fully accepting. When Christine rejoined Fleetwood Mac in 2014, Stevie described the reunion with a warmth that was entirely unperformed. Having her back felt, she said, like a room that had been missing furniture for 16 years, suddenly being complete again. They toured together. They recorded together. They sat beside each other on stages in arenas around the world. To two women in their 60s and 70s who had outlasted every prediction and every obstacle, and every person who had suggested, at various points, that perhaps their moment had passed. On November 30th, 2022, Christine McVie died. She was 79 years old. The cause was a stroke. She had been in the hospital for only a short time before she was gone. A swiftness that gave no one, including Stevie, the preparation that longer illnesses sometimes inadequately provide. Stevie's response was public and unguarded in a way that was unusual even for someone who had always been more willing than most to let her grief be visible. She posted a message that began, "A few hours ago, I was told that my best friend in the whole world since the first day of 1975 had passed away." She wrote that Christine was her soulmate, her musical partner, her anchor inside a band that had tested every form of human endurance. So she wrote that she had no words, and then proceeded, in the way of someone for whom language has always been the primary instrument of survival, to find them anyway. The loss did something specific to the question of Fleetwood Mac's future. With Christine gone, with Lindsay already removed, the band that had made Rumours, the five people who had walked into a studio in 1976 carrying their broken personal lives and emerged with one of the most celebrated albums in history, was, what in any meaningful sense, finished. Mick and John remained, but the particular alchemy that had made those five people extraordinary together had dissolved, one absence at a time, across decades of life, lived at full velocity. Stevie did not announce the end of Fleetwood Mac. She did not need to. The silence spoke with the eloquence that only genuine finality produces. What she was left with, in the aftermath of those losses, Tom, Christine, the effective end of the band, or the rupture with Lindsay, the decades of her own survival that had cost her so much, was something that took time to identify and more time to accept. It was not emptiness. Emptiness would have been simpler. It was fullness of a different kind. The particular fullness of a life so thoroughly lived that every corner of it carries the mark of something that mattered. She was in her mid-70s. She had buried friends and lovers and versions of herself. She had surrendered substances that had promised relief and delivered destruction. She had stood on stages before hundreds of millions of people across 6 decades and given them something real. Not the performance of emotion, but the emotion itself, translated into sound and offered without reservation. And she was still here. That fact, the bare, stubborn, extraordinary fact of her continued presence, was not something she took lightly. She had known too many people who had not made it this far. Tom had not. Christine had not. Robin Anderson, her closest friend from before the fame, had not. The list of people she had loved who were no longer in the world was long enough to constitute its own kind of haunting. But haunting, Stevie had learned, does not have to mean paralysis. The dead do not ask us to stop living. If they loved us, and hers had loved her, they ask us to keep going, to keep writing, to keep climbing the stairs to the stage in whatever condition we arrive, and to give whatever we still have to give. She still had a great deal. In 2020, a 24-year-old man named Nathan Apodaca filmed himself skateboarding down a highway in Idaho, drinking cranberry juice from a bottle, with Dreams by Fleetwood Mac playing through his phone speaker. He posted the video on TikTok. Within days, it had been viewed hundreds of millions of times. Within weeks, Dreams, a song recorded in 1976, written by a woman sitting alone in a side room with a keyboard and a set of headphones, it became the most streamed classic rock song in the history of Spotify. Stevie Nicks watched it happen from her home in Los Angeles, and she wept. Not from vanity, not from the satisfaction of a commercial milestone, but from the particular emotion that arrives when you understand, viscerally and without warning, that something you made in pain has traveled further than you ever imagined possible and landed, decades later, in the hands of people who were not yet born when you recorded it. Or that the girl who scrubbed floors in Los Angeles and wrote songs in the margins of exhaustion had made something that a young man on a skateboard in Idaho needed in 2020, the same way millions of people had needed it in 1977. That is not fame. That is something older and more significant than fame. That is what art does when it is made honestly enough. At 76 years old, Stevie Nicks occupies a position in American culture that has no precise equivalent. She is not simply a legacy act, not simply a museum piece from a golden era, not simply the woman who used to spin in chiffon on Saturday Night Live. She is actively, stubbornly, defiantly present, still writing, still performing, still capable of walking onto a stage and producing in a room full of strangers the particular silence that precedes genuine awe. Her voice has changed. She would be the first to tell you so, with the directness that has always been one of her most underrated qualities. The upper register has narrowed. The instrument carries now the marks of everything it has been through. The cocaine years, the Klonopin years, the decades of touring, the grief that is its own kind of physical toll. But what remains is, in many ways, more powerful than what age has taken. There is a texture in her voice now, a weight, an authority that only comes from a life fully inhabited. And when she sings Edge of 17 today, she is not performing a memory. She is a woman in her 70s singing a song she wrote in her 30s, and every year between those 2 points is audible in every note. That is not a diminishment. That is a document. She has spoken in recent years about the young women who come to her shows. Women in their 20s and 30s who discovered Fleetwood Mac through TikTok, through their mother's record collections, or through the sudden viral resurrection of songs that predated their existence. She sees in them what her grandfather once saw in her, the recognition of something in the music that the music is only partially responsible for. The rest of it comes from inside the listener. The music simply gives it permission to exist. She thinks often, she has said, about Christine, about Tom, about Robin, about the version of herself that existed before the losses accumulated into their current weight. She carries them with her onto every stage, the way all survivors carry their dead. Not as burdens, but as presence. As the irreplaceable evidence of a life that touched other lives deeply enough to leave permanent marks in both directions. Her philanthropic work has expanded quietly alongside her music. She has donated extensively to music education programs, to organizations supporting women in recovery, to causes that reflect the specific geography of her own survival. Oh, she does not announce these contributions with the fanfare of someone managing a public image. She makes them the way she made her best music. Because the alternative, which is indifference, has never been something she was capable of. She has never married. She has no children. These are facts that the world has sometimes treated as lacunae, as absences that require explanation or apology. Stevie has never agreed. She has said, with the quiet conviction of someone who arrived at their understanding the hard way, that the life she chose required the totality of what she had to give. That the music, the decades on the road, the millions of people who carried her songs through their own losses and loves and survivals, that was her family. That was her legacy. Not in the diminished sense, as a consolation for something else, but in the fullest sense, as the thing she was always meant to build. She still wears black. Mind, she still spins when the song calls for it and the body permits. She still writes in notebooks, still arrives at melodies from somewhere that she has never been able to fully locate or explain. Still believes, with the faith of someone who has tested that belief against every conceivable obstacle, that the next song might be the most important one she has ever written. Perhaps that is the truest thing about Stevie Nicks. Not the records sold or the halls of fame or the decades of survival that constitute a resume unlike any other woman in rock history, but the fact that after everything, after the floors scrubbed and the love lost, and the years stolen by substances and the friends buried, and the band that was her home for 50 years effectively dissolved, she still believes in the next song. That belief, stubborn and luminous and entirely unreasonable, is the real legacy, not the myth. The woman. And now, what the stage is yours? What has her music carried you through? What song of hers arrived at exactly the moment you needed it most? Leave it in the comments. Not as a tribute to a legend, but as the continuation of a conversation she began over 50 years ago and has never stopped having with anyone willing to listen. Subscribe and stay. Because the story of a woman who refused, against every odd, to go quietly, is never really finished.